Good? Okay, Daf Tzadi Aleph and Aleph at the two dots. V'chol Adam ein chayavin alav ela keshi'uro. That if a person, an individual, has a special regard for seeds, right? Seeds that for other people might be used for food, but for him they're going to be used for planting. Or he's got a special kind of item that he's going to use for remedy, but other people would use for food. So for him, he's been given additional chashivas, and therefore carrying even a small amount would make him liable. But for another person to carry it, since they don't have that mental designation, they would have to use the shear of a grogeres for a food item in order to be chayav. That's what the Mishnah had said. Masnisin deloka Reb Shimon ben Elazar. Our Mishnah is not like Reb Shimon ben Elazar. The Tanya Klal Omer Reb Shimon ben Elazar. He had said a general rule called She'eno kosher lahatzniya ve'ein matzniyin kamohu, that if you have an item that is normally not assigned that chashivus of putting it away for storage, but one individual decides that it's important to him, and therefore he puts it away into storage, designating its chashivus. And then if another person comes along and takes that item and carries it, even though it's pachos mikashir, even though it's not the requisite shear, but it has chashivus, this other person, even though for him it's not chashuv, but because the owner had designated it its additional chashivus, he becomes liable just like the owner himself. That's what Reb Shimon ben Elazar says, but our Mishnah clearly says not that way. Our Mishnah says that just because the owner had designated it with chashivus, if I carry it and I don't have that same chashivus of the item, then I'm not going to be liable. Amar Rava Amar Rav Nachman Hotzi kiguro geres la'achila v'nimlach aleha lizriya. Now here's an interesting concept. What if a person takes this item, this seed, okay, and this seed for him, when he first carries it outside, it's pachos mikrogeres, it's smaller than the shear, and he carries it outside with the thought that it is going to be used for food. So at that moment, he's not doing anything wrong. He's not doing a malacha. But then, while he's in the process of carrying it outside, before he puts it down, he changes his mind and says, you know what, I'm going to use this for planting. So in the course of doing the malacha, he has changed his mind and assigned it with the chashivas. Or if he originally had designated it for planting and then in the course of carrying it out changes his mind and decides he's going to use it for achila, chayiv. So then the halacha is he's still going to be chayiv. So the Gemara says pshita. Now here we're talking about a case, I have to just correct myself. Here we're talking about a case where there is the requisite shear. You have a grogeres size of seeds. Okay, you have a grogeres size of seeds. So since he changed his mind, that's just not going to affect the fact that he's chayiv, because regardless of whether it's a food item or a planting item, he has the shear, so he's going to be chayiv either way. So the Gemara says pshita. That should be a fairly obvious assumption, because zil hacha ika shiur v'zil hacha ika shiur. Because regardless of whether you designate it for planting or for eating, you have the requisite shear either way. So what's the chiddush that Rav Nachman is teaching me? So mahu detema ba'inen akira v'hanacha b'chadam machshava v'haleka kamash malan. You might have thought that since when you did the akira, it was an akira as a food item, and now it's a hanacha as a planting item. Therefore, the thing that you picked up is not the same thing that you put down, and therefore you don't have an akira and a hanacha of the same item, so to speak, because you've changed your mental designation. So kamash malan, that no, since physically it's the same item and it has the shear of a kigrogeres, you're going to be chayiv. So that's the first thing that we had to lay down. Now, based on that principle, Boy Rava asked the following question: Hotzi chatzi grogeres lizriya. What happens if you have pachos mikashir? What happens if you have less than the requisite size? You have, let's say, only half of the size of seeds, half the size of a grogeres of seeds. V'tavcha. And then you, and your intention, however, was when you were carrying out these seeds, you were going to take them out for planting. So even though you don't have the requisite shear of a grogeres, since the purpose of the seeds is for zriya, you are still going to be theoretically in violation if you carry through and do your hanacha. But what happens is, v'tavcha, in the course of carrying it outside, the seeds expand. They chemically expand for whatever reason, either through moisture or whatever other reason. V'nimlach aleha la'achila. And then you change your mind at the same time that these seeds expand, so that you're going to use them for food, and then you put them down. So that by the time you put them down, you now have the size of a kigarogeres. You have the requisite shear for eating, and you picked it up. You didn't have the shear, but it was for zriya. And now you put it down for achila, and you have the requisite shear for achila. So mahu, what will be the halacha? Im tim salom arhasam hu demichayiv de zilhacha ika shiura bezilhacha ika shiura. He says maybe in the previous case where you changed your mind, the reason why we said that you're chayiv is because you always maintained the requisite shear of a kigarogeres when you picked it up and when you put it down in our previous case. Our previous case was where you had the grogeres size of seeds, when you picked it up and when you put it down, and that's why we said you're chayiv. Over here, when you picked it up, you only had half the size of a grogeres, and it's only when you put it down that it had expanded to the size of a grogeres. But over here, since the thing that makes you chayiv when you put it down is that you've decided to use it for food, but lemaisa, when you picked it up, it did not have the shear for food. And therefore, maybe you're going to be putter over here. Or maybe no. Maybe the proper way to look at it is, look, when I picked it up, my thoughts, my designation was for planting. And for planting, I did have the requisite amount. And had I remained quiet and not changed my mental designation, then I would surely be chayiv. So perhaps I'm going to be chayiv here over here as well. Even though by the time that when I put it down, my thoughts are for achila, are for food and not for planting, and I have the requisite shear for food, but maybe that's a problem because when I picked it up, I didn't have the shear for food. So from that perspective, I'm going to be putter. But on the other hand, maybe you're supposed to look at the way that I picked it up. When I picked it up, I had the requisite shear for planting, and if I hadn't changed my designation, I would still be chayiv. So here I'm going to be chayiv as well.
Why do you have the requisite shear? I'm just a little.
Okay, let's go over it again. For planting, you don't need the size of a grogeres. For planting, you need even just the smallest amount. You give a mental designation of chashivas when you decide you're going to use something for planting. The only time that you need the size of a grogeres is if it's for eating. Okay? Good?
So if he left with the thought to eat it, and it didn't have the shear, then on the way when you put it down, it did have the shear.
We're going to get to the what-ifs in just a second. The what-ifs are going to be following in the Gemara, but let's just take the case in front of us first. No, you picked it up for planting, and it was less than a grogeres. You put it down for eating, and it's the size of a grogeres. What's going to be the halacha? Now, the imtim salomar. Now let's go to the next, the imtim salomar, the what-if. Kevin de ilu ishtik v'lo chashiv olei michayev ha'machshava dizriya hashtanami michayev. If you're going to argue that in this case he is going to be chayiv because we look at the fact that when you picked it up and your thoughts were for planting, then we follow through with that, and as long as you have the shear for achila, when you put it down, you're going to be chayiv. So hotzi kigarogeres la achila v'tzamka. What happens if you picked up the seeds, and at the time that you picked it up, it had the shear of a grogeres? And so therefore, you're doing something that's problematic because you have the shear and you have the thought for eating. And then over the course of carrying it outside, v'tzamka, it shrivels up. V'nimlach alei lizriya. And then you decide, you change your mental designation, and you're going to use it for planting now. So by the time you're putting it down, since you've given it additional chashivas, you don't need the shear of a grogeres anymore, even though it doesn't have the shear of a grogeres. Mahu. What would you say in that case? Now, in this scenario, if you would have carried through on your original mental designation, you wouldn't be chayiv over here, and therefore there's a good argument to say that you're putter over here. Or maybe no. Maybe the fact that now my mental designation is for planting, and I have the shear for planting, so maybe I should be chayiv here as well. And if you're going to argue that you look at what it is right now, and since right now my mental designation fits the shear because it's pachos mika grogeres and my thoughts are for planting, and therefore I should be chayiv, Hotzi kigrogeres la'achila v'tzamka v'chazra v'tavcha mahu. Now let me ask you another what if. My what if is as follows. What if I pick up the seeds and they're the size of a grogeres and my thoughts are for eating? And then in the course of carrying it out, it shrivels, v'chazra v'tavcha, and then it re-puffs up. So let's say I'm carrying it for a mile. I could be carrying it for a mile before I do a hanacha. So I leave it, it's on my back, and it's in the hot sun, and the sun shrivels it up, so now it's no longer a shirvik grogeres, and then it starts to rain, and it puffs up again, and by the time I'm ready to take my knapsack off and put it down on the ground, it's now got the shear again. What will be the halach over there? Yesh dichoy le'inyan Shabbos, o ein dichoy le'inyan Shabbos. Do you say that because over the course of the carrying it was temporarily precluded from the possibility of doing the malacha and therefore going to be pater? Or do we say no, since at the time of Akira it had the requisite shear and the time of Hanach it had the requisite shear, I'm going to be chayiv? On all of these questions the Gemara says take, or we're going to let it sit. We don't have an answer. Ba'aminei Ravim Rav Nachman, Rav asked Rav Nachman the following question. Zorak kezayis truma labayis tomei mahu. What would be the halacha if a person picks up a kezayis of truma? Truma, there's an obligation for you to preserve the tahara of truma. It is an isser d'oraisa to expose truma to tuma, to a source of tuma. I go ahead and I pick up a kezayis of truma and I throw it into a window where there's a corpse. What's going to be the halacha? Or where there's a sheretz and it lands on the sheretz, right? What's going to be the halacha? Lamai. So the Gemara's question is, why are you asking this question? Ila inyan Shabbos. If the question is, am I chayiv for doing a malacha on Shabbos because I'm throwing it from a reshus harabim to a reshus hayachid, kigrogeres ba'inan. You would need, in order to be liable, the size of a grogeres, which is larger, much larger than the size of a kezayis. Ila inyan tuma kebeitza ochlin ba'inan. If the issue is, does the truma become tameh? In order for the truma to become tameh, it has to be the size of a kebeitza, in order for it to contract tuma. In other words, for it to be able to transmit tuma to other things, right? You need the size of a kebeitza. So the Gemara says, la'olam le'inyan Shabbos. Answers the Gemara, my question is vis-a-vis the laws of Shabbos as follows. Uchagon de'ika pachos mikebeitza ochlin. And the case is over here. The case is over here where I have pachos mikebeitza of truma and v'hai mashlimo lebeitza, and I throw it onto an item which supplements its shear of kebeitza. So basically, what happens is that I take my kezayis of truma, I throw it into a house, and it lands on other food which supplements its shear to make it to the size of a kebeitza. So there are a lot of things happening simultaneously. Simultaneous to its landing on the ground and there being a hanacha, it also is being supplemented to the size of a kebeitza, and it is also becoming tamei at that very moment. So my midabintstaref le'inyan tuma michayev nami le'inyan Shabbos, o dilma kol le'inyan Shabbos kigrogeres bo'ina. The question, therefore, is, like Rashi, if you take a look at the bottom Rashi, he asks as follows: Midachashav hachzerika le'inyan tuma, chashav nami le'inyan Shabbos keilu higrogeres u'michayev olo. The very fact that this act of throwing causes a tuma to set into this food, the very fact that this act of throwing, of transference, causes a chalos, a setting in of tuma, it may therefore upgrade the importance of this act of throwing, such that even though normally you need the size of a grogeres in order to be chayiv for the act of hotza'ah on Shabbos, but here, since Isser is setting into this, or Tumah setting into this object through this act of transference is sort of upgraded in its importance, and therefore, even though you have less than the size of a grogeres, you're still considered to be liable for the act of hotzah.
Is it the transference or the fact that it's now combined with the other thing, and now you're looking at it as being part of a whole kibbetza? So it's as if he threw an entire kibbetza.
You see, even if you threw in an entire,
you read it in the Rashi.
Even if you threw in the entire kibbetza, I think the kibbetza.
He says, "Midachashiv hachzrika linyan tuma." So in other words, this rika now makes a complete kibbetza in the house.
No. It's the subject of Rashi is the zrika.
Yes.
The subject is the zrika. If you take a look, there's a Tosfos over here who clarifies it a little bit further. It's a very complicated case, and this seems to Tosfos is bothered with the fact that it's a little bit overcomplicated. He says, he says the Tumah and the Hanacha of Shabbos are happening simultaneously. You're not going to be chayiv until there's a Hanacha of the object coming to rest. Right? You continue. You have to skip a few lines in Tosfos. He says the dafka nakat kazayis truma diika isra laochlo betuma volpachos mikazayis lo. He says, and the reason why we talk about a kazayis is because you need to start with something such that if you were to eat it, you would incur an isra deoraisa in its tuma state. So anyway, I don't want to get too bogged down into the case. But the bottom line is that the question is that does the transference of this object, by virtue of the fact that it has caused a tumah to set in, causes it to become a more important act of transference, such that even though normally in this case you would not be chayiv for Melecha Shabbos because you don't have the requisite shear, since you do have the requisite shear for tumah, that would also create a requisite shear for the act of the malacha of Shabbos of transference.
We don't look at his das at all.
We're not looking at his das at all. So this is the question. So Amarlei Tinisua. So he said to him, we've already learned this in a brisa. Abashol Omer Shtei Halechem V'Lechem Haponim Shiurin Kigrogeres. That it says in the brisa that if a person carries the Shtei Halechem or the Lechem Haponim, in other words, these are foods that are meant to be eaten by a Kohen. They're sacrificial breads that are in the temple. If you carry them outside on Shabbos, how much do you have to carry to be liable? You need to have the size of a grogeres. Va'amai. But why should that be? Lema midla inyan yosei b'kazayis linyan Shabbos nami b'kazayis. Why don't we say that you should be liable even if you carry less? Because by virtue of the fact that if you take this outside the temple, you're going to be liable for removing a holy food outside the temple, and all you need is the shear of a kazayas to passel the lechem haponim and the shtei halechem. So therefore, this transference from inside the temple to outside the temple is an important unto itself by just having a kazayas. So why don't you say that all you need is a kazayas to be liable for the melecha Shabbos of Hotzah as well? The fact that we don't say that proves that just because something's transference is upgraded to only require the size of a kazayas, that doesn't transfer to the laws of grogeres for Shabbos. So hachi hashta hasam. So the Gemara says that's not a good comparison. Hasam ida'afke chutz l'chomas ha'azara ifsulei biyotze and ha'Shabbos lo michayiv adamafik le'lerishus harabim. The Gemara says in that case of the lechem, of the bread being taken out of the temple, the two acts of transference, one for Shabbos and one for making the sacrificial bread pasul, are at two different stages. When does the sacrificial bread become pasul? Once you take it outside the temple courtyard. But are you in a Rishus Harabim at that point? No, you're not in a Rishus Harabim until you take it further out. I guess the temple mount right outside the courtyard is not considered to be a Rishus Harabim yet, because you have a certain kind of you have something called the chel. You have like a lattice work that is sort of like an outside sort of buffer before you take it mamish outside to Rishus Harabim, and therefore you become chayiv in paseling the lechem hapanim before you actually bring it out to Rishus Harabim. And since they're not happening simultaneously, you can't argue that the shear of a kazayas will transfer to the laws of Shabbos. But Hacha Shabbos the Tumah Bahadi Hadodi Ka'asyan. But over here, the act of Hanacha, of the object coming to a rest, is happening simultaneously with its becoming Tameh. And therefore, one could argue that the shear of Kizayas, by virtue of the fact that it helps to have this object become Tameh when it joins together with the other food, it'll also make you chayiv when you do a hanacha in that case of kazayas. So the Gemara is, this is an ibai de lo ifshita, this is a question that remains unanswered, but it's an interesting sort of conceptual question. Next, chazar v'hichniso eno chayiv ela kishiuro, that if a person had taken out seeds outside after he had given it a mental designation for planting, so, and then he changes his mind and he wants to bring it back inside, but by this time he's now thought about it for food, and it doesn't have the size of a grogeres. So, Eino chayiv ela kishir, you're not going to be chayiv unless it actually has the requisite shear. So the Gemara says, why did the Mishnah need to say that? That's pshita, that's obvious, since you changed your mind. Amar Abaya hacha b'maya skinan kigon shezarko la'otzar u'makomo nikar. We're talking about a case where what you did was, in the course of changing your mind, you didn't actively say, you know what, I'm going to use this now for food. What you did is that you said, or you didn't do anything, you just threw it into a storage shed, and normally things that you throw into a storage shed are meant for food. So your actions reflect upon the fact that your designation is changing. It's not that you mentally changed your designation, but you did an act that is reflective upon a change in its status. Now, the sort of the gray area here is that when you throw it into the shed, it doesn't scatter all over the place, but you drop it into the shed, and you can still recognize where the object is in the shed, so it's easily retrievable if you ever want to get it and take it out for planting. So therefore, mahu detema kevin de makomo nikar b'milse kamaisakoi, that since it's easily retrievable, you can identify exactly where it is in the shed. Maybe that's not enough of a change to change it to now for the purposes of food, and it still retains its original status for zriya, and therefore if you carry it back inside, you're going to be chayiv even as smaller than the shear. Kamash malon midizarki laotzer betule batle. No, the chiddush of the Mishnah is, by virtue of the fact that you threw it into a food shed, shows that its designation has changed, and therefore, if you were to carry it back inside the house, you would not be chayiv because it's smaller than the shear of a grogeres. Okay.
All these shurim, are they midrabanan too, or is it only midrabanan?
This is midioraisa.
Midrabanan,
obviously, midrabanan even a small amount, unless it's something that doesn't have any chashivas at all, like a piece of lint, like a piece of lint or a crumb in your pocket. Mishnah, hamotzi ochlin v'nostan al ha'askofa. The Mishnah says that if a person carries food outside on Shabbos, but instead of taking it all the way out to Rishus Harabim, you place it on the threshold of the door. So, bein shechazar v'hotzian acher pater mipnei shelo asa melachto bevas echas. It makes no difference whether later on you pick it up off the threshold and put it outside, or whether someone else does that. In both cases, you're going to be pater. Why? Because even though you originally picked it up in a Rishus HaYachid and it later ended up getting into Rishus HaRabim, since it rested on top of the threshold in the interim, you haven't done the malacha in one fell swoop, and therefore you're going to be pater from the malacha. The Gemara will hopefully clarify for us what status this threshold has. If it's a Rishus HaRabim, so then you've done the malacha. If it's a Rishus HaYachid, then when you pick it up again and pull it outside, you've also done the malacha. So what is this threshold? We'll have to clarify. Next, kupa shimolea peros v'nosna ali skofa achitzona. If you have a box that's filled with produce, and you put it on the outer threshold, which means that just beyond that threshold is Rishus HaRabim. Apal pisharov peros mi bachutz pater achiotzi eskola kupa. What we're describing over here is a box which is partially on the threshold, which is not yet Rishus HaRabim, and partially outside in Rishus HaRabim. Since the entire box is not out in Rishus HaRabim, you haven't yet done the malacha, and therefore you're going to be pater. The Gemara here too will clarify this. Let's go on. The Gemara now says, Hi Yiskofamai. We have to clarify, what is this threshold that we first started talking about, where we said that if you pick up a box and you put it on the threshold, and then you pick it up again later on, and you carry it out to Rishus HaRabim, you're going to be pater because you haven't done the malacha in one fell swoop. If you're going to tell me that the threshold has the status of a Rishus Harabim because it's beyond the door, then I don't understand why you haven't done a malacha. Why are you potter over here? You've transferred from a Rishus Hayachid to Rishus Harabim, i.e. the threshold. So why should you be potter? So Ella Iskofa Rishus Hayachid. So then the other option is that the Iskofa, the threshold, is still part of the door frame, and therefore it's still part of the Rishus Hayachid. So my question is, Bein Shechazer v'Hotzin, Bein Shehotzin Acher Potter, Hakamatik Mi Rishus Hayachid LeRishus Harabim. Then why, when you pick it up from the threshold and take it outside, are you potter? Doesn't make any sense. You're transferring from Rishus Hayachid to Rishus Harabim. So Ella Iskofa Carmelis. So rather, the Gemara says that we're dealing with the case of where the Iskofa is a Carmelis. Now, what kind of Carmelis is this? So we had learned before that the definition of a Carmelis is if it's a 4 by 4, it's 4 tfachim by 4 tfachim in floor area, right? And it's between 3 and 9 tfachim high. So it's neither a Rishus Hayachid. If it was a Rishus Hayachid, it'd have to be up to 10 tfachim high, and nor is it a Rishus Harabim because if it's higher than 3 tfachim off the ground. So it's therefore classified as a Carmelis, which in this case prevents you from doing a malacha by transferring it from Rishus Hayachid to that Carmelis, and from transferring it from that Carmelis to Rishus Harabim. The Hakamashmalan, and therefore what the Mishnah is telling me is Taima Denach beCarmelis, that the reason why you're potter is because temporarily at least this box came to a rest in the Carmelis before being transferred directly from a Rishus Hayachid to Rishus Harabim. What we can, however, infer from that is Halo Nach beCarmelis Michayev, that if it had not yet come to a rest in the Carmelis, let's say I carry the box, carry it through the Carmelis without putting it down in the Carmelis, but I carry it through the Carmelis and then transfer it to Rishus Harabim, it sounds like from the Mishnah that I'll be chayiv. The only reason I'm potter over here is because I put it down in the Carmelis, temporarily letting it come to a rest. So Mashnisin, therefore, Deloke ben Azai. Therefore, we can adduce from this whole discussion that our Mishnah is not like Ben Azai. Tanya Hamotze Mechanus Lepaltia Derech Stav Chayiv Ben Azai Poter. As the Brisa had said, that if a person is carrying from a paltia, which is a Rishus Hayachid, out into the street, and he does it via a stav, which is a Carmelis, it's a place which is, let's say, a porch which is fenced in, so it's a Carmelis. And the fact that I've carried it through that fenced-in area out into the Rishus Harabim makes me potter, but makes me chayiv, because I haven't put it down in the Carmelis. And Ben Azai says you're potter, because Ben Azai says that you look at it as while you're walking through the Carmelis, it's as if you've put it down. And so, therefore, you freeze the frame, and if at the freeze frame you've only done an akira in Rishus Hayachid and a hanach in a Carmelis because of the freeze frame, then when you commence carrying it through, it's a new akira in a Carmelis and a hanach in Rishus Harabim, and therefore you're potter. Our Mishnah does not subscribe to that freeze frame theory of Ben Azai, and it says that as long as you have never come to a stop in the Carmelis, and you started with an akira in Rishus Hayachid and ended with a hanach in Rishus Harabim, you're going to be chayiv. Okay, that's a good deal. Next, if you have a box that is filled with produce and you transfer it onto the threshold, and part of the box is in Rishus Harabim and part of the box is still on the threshold, which is not a Rishus Harabim, you're not going to be chayiv. That's what the Mishnah had said. So Amar Chizkiya lo shanu ela bekupa maleya kishuan uduluyim avol maleya chardal chayav. So Chizkiya tells us a huge chiddush, and he says that this halacha that your potter is only true if the contents of the box also are partially in and partially out. What do we mean to say? You're dealing with cucumbers and gourds where they are long. They go across the length of the box, or the width of the box as the case may be, such that all of the cucumbers are partially in the house and partially out of the house. And that's why you're going to be potter. But if, let's say, the box was filled with mustard seed, and therefore, by placing the box partially in and partially out, some of the mustard seeds are completely outside the house now, according to Chizkiah, you're going to be chayiv, because Lamaisa, some of the mustard seeds were removed from a Rishus HaYachid and deposited into Rishus HaRabim. Alma Kisavar Eged Klilo Shmei Eged. So you see, according to Chizkiah, just because they are consolidated inside a box does not make them considered to be one unit. You still look at the individual particles inside the box as being disparate and separate entities, such that the seeds that are outside, even though the box unites them and consolidates them, and the box is partially in and partially out. Rabbi Yochanan Amar afilu maleya chardal patur. And Rabbi Yochanan disagrees, and he says even if the box is filled with mustard seeds, you're still going to be patur. Why? Because alma kasaver eged kli shmei eged. Because he holds that the box consolidates all of its contents, and since the box is partially in and partially out, then we look at the contents as being the same status as the consolidating box, and therefore you haven't done a complete hanacha in Rishus HaRabim. It's only partial hanacha in Rishus HaRabim, and therefore you're going to be patur.
Does it matter if it's majority in or out? Or
no, it doesn't make a difference. It seems like even if a portion of the box is still you need a complete hanacha outside. Amar Reb Zera. Reb Zera says Masnisim delo Chizkiah dika delo Rabbi Yochanan dika. Our Mishnah, the next few lines is really just an exercise in trying to reconcile their positions with the language of the Mishnah. So understand that that's what we're doing now. If we look at the language of our Mishnah, it seems inconsistent with Chizkiah at one point and inconsistent with Rabbi Yochanan at another point. It's not consistent with Chizkiah linguistically, because the Mishnah says that you're only chayiv if you remove the entire box outside. It sounds like from the language that even if some of the contents of the box are completely outside, as long as the box is not completely outside, you're going to be potter. So you see that the Mishnah seems to be implying over here that you look at the consolidation of the box and not at the individual particles inside the box, not like Chizkiah. And Kareb Yochanan Lodika Dikatani Afal Pisharov Peros Bechutz. And it's also inconsistent with Rabbi Yochanan linguistically, because later on the Mishnah says that even if most of the produce is outside, you're still going to be potter. So time of derov peros, hakol peros, afal gav de agida kupa, migavoy chayev. It seems from the second part of the Mishnah that the only reason you're going to be potter is because some of the produce is still inside and has not gone outside. But it's mashma that if all of the produce is outside and only a portion of the box is inside, then you're going to be chayev. So alma kesaver eged kalilo shmei eged. So you see from here that you don't look at the box as the consolidating factor as the criterion, but you look at the contents, and therefore it's not like Rabbi Yochanan, who says you look at the box as the defining unit of the object. So ve'el akasha is ve'el akasha. So the Gemara says, so linguistically we have akasha both on Chizkiah and on Rabbi Yochanan from our Mishnah. Chizkiah mitaritz l'taimei v'Rabbi Yochanan mitaritz l'taimei. So the Gemara says each Amora will reconcile the Mishnah linguistically in his own way. Chizkiah mitaritz l'taimei ad sheyotzi es kol hakupa b'med dvar mamurim b'kupa molei kishuin v'diluin. So Chizkiah will explain as follows. When the Mishnah says that you're only going to be liable when you remove the entire box, even though some of the produce is completely outside, no, he says, that's talking about where the box is filled with cucumbers. So since the box is filled with cucumbers that cover the entire width of the box, that's why you have to remove the entire box. But if the box was filled with mustard seeds, so then you don't have to remove the entire box. Just pushing out a portion of the box where you have whole particles of mustard seed, which is completely in Rishus HaRabim now, it's as if you've removed the entire box, and therefore you're going to be chayiv. Rabbi Yochanan mitaretz l'taimei, and Rabbi Yochanan will also linguistically reconcile it as follows: Afal pi sharov peros b'chutz v'lo rov peros bilvad ela afilu kol peros pater ad sheyotzi es kol hakupa. The way that Rashi explains it, it's almost like a lozu afzu, that really the Mishnah is not telling you the whole story, but it's telling you a portion of it, and you can infer an even bigger chiddush as well. That even though the Mishnah says that even if the majority of the produce is outside, you're still going to be potter. It's not just even if the majority of the produce is outside, even if all of the produce is outside but a portion of the box is still inside, you're going to be potter, because the box is the criterion of determining what is the object that is being transferred. So now, Meisve. So now that we've reconciled each Amora linguistically with the Mishnah, let's get down to the logic now. We present a challenge. Hamotzi kupas harochlin v'nasna al askofa hachitzona. The Brisa says that if a person carries outside on Shabbos a peddler's box. Remember, a peddler's box was multi-component. It was a multi-component box, and he had all different kinds of wares inside the box, and you place it on the outer threshold, so you put it outside now. Even though the majority of the components of the box are now in Rishus Harabim, but since a portion of the box is inside still, you're going to be potter. So the thinking of this, of our original analysis of this brisa, is that we're talking about a peddler's box. Peddlers usually sell fragrant items, and therefore, even though you're dealing with small little bundles of spice or fragrance, which would mean that some of those components are completely outside, even though the box is partially inside. This is a problem to Chizkiah, because according to Chizkiah, you don't look at the consolidating boxes of criteria, but you look at the individual components inside. And if even one of the individual components is completely outside, you're chayiv. So then why should you be potter according to Chizkiah? So Amar Lecha Chizkiah hacha b'mayaskinan be'urnasi. So Chizkiah says, no, you're jumping to assumptions, right? You're jumping to conclusions incorrectly, because really that Bryce is talking about where the peddler's box is filled with herbs and bundles, which are very long herbs, very long strips of herbs, which go from one end of the box to the other. And that's why you're potter, is because even the contents of the box are not completely outside. But I Chizkiah, hold that if the contents of the box, a portion of the contents of the box are outside, you're going to be chayiv. So Masav Rav Bibi Bar Abaya, Hagonev Kis B'Shabbos Chayiv, Shekvar Nischayiv B'Geneva Kadam Shiyav Lidei Isser Shabbos. This is a fascinating halacha. Now, there's a halacha called Kimlei B'Derabba Minei. What does Kimlei B'Derabba Minei mean? It means that if a person commits two Isurim simultaneously, let's say one of the Isurim makes you liable for the death penalty, and the other Isur makes you liable for monetary restitution. So, for example, I decide I'm going to murder you, and the way I murder you is by taking your vase and crashing it over your head. So that's a good method of murder, right? So now what I do is I take a Ming vase of yours that's worth $10,000, and I smash it over your head. So while I've murdered you, I've also incurred a penalty that I'm liable to you now for $10,000. The halacha is that since my act of murder makes me liable for the death penalty, I'm potter from paying you for your vase. It's a really good way of sticking it to you. I mean, they're going to hang me for it, but at least I've gotten the pleasure. I got the pleasure of breaking your vase. Okay, so but that's the halacha of Kimlei B'Derabba Minei. That since there's a simultaneity of the two commissions, since I'm being put to death for the one, I'm potter from tashlumin for the other. However, let's say I commit an act of theft concomitant with the violation of Shabbos. So I pick up your money bag, your leather pouch that's filled with silver coins, and I carry it outside on Shabbos. There the Mishnah says that I will be chayiv both the death penalty for violating Shabbos, plus I'll have to pay you back for the money that I stole from you. What's the reason? Because here they're not occurring simultaneously. At what point am I liable for the act of Geneva? Once I pick up the bag, even before I've left your house and carried it outside. And therefore, since there's a lack of simultaneity, because my liability for Geneva takes place when I pick it up while I'm still in your house, and my liability for Shabbos only occurs after I carry it outside the house, I'm going to be chayiv for both. I am chayiv both the death penalty for Shabbos violation, plus I'm chayiv to pay you back for the money that I stole from you. However,
didn't you pick up a vase first, though?
Picking up a vase is not what held. I don't have the intention of stealing your vase. I only have the intention of breaking your vase. The reason I'm chayiv is because I broke your vase. right? So therefore,
I would have been happy to kill you without breaking the vase off. So.
That's right. Next. But here's a case where if you wanted to really chaparine, if you wanted to really come up with a kunz, here's where you could be putter from tashlumin. What's the case? If, however, I schlep the money bag without picking it up, I just drag it across the floor and then pull it outside. So since my act of geneva is only consummated by pulling it outside the house because I didn't pick it up, then the act of geneva and the act of chilul Shabbos occur simultaneously, and therefore, when they take me to the gallows, I can say, I'm not paying you for the money that I stole from you. Here it's not the gallows, it's taking me out to skila.
I have a nice funeral.
Right. The isal kadaitach. So now the Gemara's question is as follows. The isal kadaitach eged klish me eged kadim le iser geneva le iser Shabbos. The Gemara's question is as follows. If you're going to argue that you look at the consolidating box as the unit that needs to get outside, so then there really is not simultaneity in this case either of the dragging. Why? Because when have I consummated the act of geneva? At the moment where the mouth of the money bag is now outside. Even if the remainder of the bag is still inside, as long as the opening of the bag is outside and I have access to pulling the coins out, that's when I've completed the act of geneva before the money bag has been completely pulled outside. So there's like a second or two lag between the commission of geneva and the commission of chilul Shabbos. And therefore I should be chayiv for both even in this case. That's the Gemara's question. If it's a kasha on Rabbi Yochanan who says eged klish me eged, that the consolidating box or bag is the defining factor. I'm not taking questions. So the Gemara's answer is as follows: Ida afke derech piv hachanami. If you pulled it out in the normative way where the mouth of the bag is coming out first, you're right. Then there is no simultaneity in the case. But here you schlep out the money bag through the bottom side, so that the mouth of the bag is coming out last, and therefore the act of geneva is consummated exactly at that moment when the entire bag is pulled outside and I've done an act of chilul Shabbos. So frak the Gemara v'ha'ika makom chalama. But 1 second, says the Gemara, even if you pull it out backwards, where the bottom side of the bag is coming out, there's usually a seam at the bottom of the bag which you could theoretically rip open because a leather pouch is sewed up with pieces of leather. So you could theoretically, even if you, let's say, freeze the frame where you're just pulling the first little part of the bottom of the bag outside, freeze the frame there, and imagine the guy unstitching the bottom of the bag to be able to get out the money. So you actually have consummated the act of geneva before chilul Shabbos takes place, even when you pull the bag outside backwards, argues the Gemara. The boy mafkale v'shakil. And then that, because if you wanted to, you could pull it out by ripping open the bottom seam. The Gemara says, no, you have to conclude that we're talking about, where not only did you drag out the bag backwards, but we're also talking about benascha, where you're stealing not coins, but you're stealing a bar of silver or a bar of gold. And the bottom line is that even if you were to open up the seam from the back, you could only, the act of geneva would only be completed by pulling out the entire bar of silver outside of the guy's house. And since that takes place simultaneously with the act of chilul Shabbos, we say kimle b'derabba minei, and you're going to be potter in that situation. Frek the Gemara, v'keven di'ika shanatzin mafik le ad pume v'shari v'shakil ushnatzin agidi migavai. But the Gemara says, but I still have a problem, because what about the drawstring on the bag? This fine. You're not going to be chayiv until you actually pull out the entire bag, because we're dealing with a bar of silver or a bar of gold. But even when but by the time you pull out the entire bar, there's still drawstrings on the bag that are still inside. You're chayav for the act of geneva before the drawstrings are pulled outside. So it's not simultaneous anymore. So the Gemara answers the lekes shenatzin. You have to say that there's no drawstrings. V'ibais ema de'islei umekarchi iluya. Alternatively, there are drawstrings, but they're wrapped around the bag. So therefore, again, we have achieved simultaneity that at the very moment that I'm completing my act of geneva, I'm also completing my act of chilul Shabbos. And we'll hold it here for today.
Why is the act of geneva as soon as you start to drag it or regardless of when you get out of the house?
The act of geneva only is consummated when I have made it available for me to take it outside of the domain of the owner, either by picking it up in his domain and making it a part of my body, or in the case where I'm dragging it, when I've pulled it outside of his domain and I can access it and bring it outside of his domain. So therefore, the very fact that the opening of the bag is now outside, even if the object is still inside, but the opening of the bag is outside, I've completed the act of geneva.